Good morning again, everybody. I have two topics in mind to talk about today, and I haven't decided yet which one I'm going to talk about. No. I'm going to start with talking about the precepts a little. Uh, I was, as you know, I've been sort of curious about Thich Nhat Hanh's teachings recently, and so I was looking at his version of the precepts, and it's very interesting because he has incorporated um, a certain amount of kind of social justice into his precepts. So we'll come to that. But I'm going to back up and talk a little about how I understand the precepts, what they are, how they came about, etc., etc. Okay. So in this day and age, different strains of Buddhism have different numbers of precepts. So Theravadan Buddhism has 5. Zen, we have 16, right? And there's some people have 8, various numbers of precepts. And my understanding, and I got this understanding from Steph and Margaret, and I haven't been able to corroborate it, but it sounds it sounds plausible to me that the precepts originated because the Buddha was trying to give guidance to his Sangha about their conduct so that they could live together harmoniously. Okay, so as we know, in the Buddha's time, during the dry portions of the year, the monks and the nuns were out wandering around on the roads, begging and so on. And then in the rainy season, they came together as this massive sangha, and that's where the Buddha gave his talks that we now what we call the sutras, and they practiced together. Well, as you can imagine, any time you get, I don't know, I know there were times when he had over 1,000 people gathered, you're going to get disharmony, discord, and so on. So that he established these precepts as these rules for the Sangha to help them live together harmoniously, cooperatively, and so on and so forth. Now, initially, that Sangha was all male. There were no women in the Buddhist Sangha originally. They weren't allowed. And at some point, women came to petition to be admitted to the Sangha. And the Buddha said no. And Ananda, who you may remember is the Buddha's attendant, kind of said, well, wait a minute. Don't these women have Buddha nature? And Buddha said, yeah, of course women have Buddha nature. And so Ananda said, well, then why can't they be in the Sangha? And the Buddha realized that he was wrong. It was kind of an interesting moment there. And so we now had the advent of having nuns coming into the Sangha. But whereas the men had I don't remember the number. It was a lot, like 179 rules that they had to follow. They figured they needed more rules for the women, so they had like 300 rules they had to follow. It's a part of our history that's not often talked about, and it's I think problematic when we look through at historical phenomenon like this through the lens of our times, and maybe it's not. But let's look at the Buddha's life. Here he was, a married man with children, and he picked up and went off into the forest to realize himself. He just left his wife and kids. Now, certainly through our lens, that would not be acceptable. I don't even know if it was acceptable at that time, but it's what he did. He felt that pursuing enlightenment, pursuing realization was more important than being with his family. Now they lived in the palace. They had well. I mean, it's not like they weren't going to eat if he wasn't there. But that said, he did that. So whether so our origins are not in some ways outstanding, but that in the context of the society at that time, that was considered normal. So we have these large sets of precepts. And over the centuries, these get boiled down to where, again, we in Zen have 16 precepts. Theravadan Buddhism has 5 precepts. And other groups have other 8 is the other number that I see popping up. So I became interested in Thich Nhat Hanh's version of he uses the 5 precept version. And everybody says, oh, these are the original 5 precepts of the Buddha. Well, that may be true. But again, what I learned from Stephen Margaret was that there were many more precepts originally. And then these, I don't know if they've got distilled down to 5 during his lifetime or after his lifetime or where that happened. Now, Thich Nhat Hanh calls them the 5 wonderful precepts. And well, I think you'll find them interesting. And in many ways, they're significantly different from our 16 precepts, and in some ways they echo that. So the 5 wonderful precepts, as Thich Nhat Hanh describes them: 1, do not kill. Do not let others kill. Find whatever means possible to protect life. Do not live with a vocation that is hurtful to humans and nature. So he has expanded out on that original, do not kill. Do not steal. Possess nothing that should belong to others. Respect the property of others, but prevent others from enriching themselves from human suffering and the suffering of other species on earth. So again, the original precepts is do not steal. And then he expands it to this idea of preventing others from enriching themselves from human suffering and the suffering of other species on earth. Number 3, sexual expression should not take place without love and commitment. Be fully aware of the suffering you may cause others as a result of your misconduct. To preserve the happiness of yourself and others, respect the rights and commitments of others. Number 4, do not say untruthful things. Do not spread news that you do not know to be certain. Do not criticize or condemn things that you are unsure of. Do not utter words that can cause division and hatred, that can create discord and cause the family or community to break. All efforts should be made to reconcile and resolve all conflicts. Certainly very relevant in this present moment. And then 5, Yeah, I'm gonna say, well, yeah, all right. I'm gonna spend a little time on this. But then his number five: do not use alcohol or other intoxicants. Be aware that your fine body has been transmitted to you by several previous generations and your parents. Destroying your body with alcohol and other intoxicants is to betray your ancestors and your parents and also betray the future generations. So maybe this is a good point that I'm going to segue to the precepts as we understand them. The 16 precepts. And those begin with the three refuges. I take refuge in the Buddha, I take refuge in the Dharma, and I take refuge in the Sangha. Okay. And the three pure precepts: cease from evil, do good, and do good for others. Now, then we come to the 10 grave precepts, which more or less correspond to those five that Thich Nhat Hanh is talking about. And the first grave precept is not killing, which corresponds very closely with, obviously, with do not kill. The second grave precept is not stealing. And again, that corresponds to this second one here, do not steal. Now, the third precept, as this is from this village Zendo, which is Enkyo Roshi's place, these precepts that I'm reading. So they retain the language of not misusing sex. That's been changed in a lot of places. And the third one that Thich Nhat Hanh has is also about sexual expression. The fourth precept is not lying, or I vow to take up the way of not lying. And they say, do not, Thich Nhat Hanh says, do not say untruthful things. And the fifth precept, the way the village Zendo has it, is not giving or taking drugs, which corresponds to Thich Nhat Hanh's discussion about alcohol and intoxicants. Well, let me go through the rest of these, but these have all gone through iterations. So, for example, this one, not giving or taking drugs, in many places is not clouding the mind, you know, which which is which is interesting, which I like, because drugs are not the only way that we cloud our minds, right? Alcohol and drugs are not the only things that can obscure reality, that can distract us from paying attention to this moment. Many things, right? Mosquitoes can distract us from the present moment. And with a mighty Zen slap, I help that mosquito evolve to a higher plane. So yeah, now that there, go. I violated a precept, not killing. Yeah, right. It's on. I did it in public. It's like it's recorded now on this thing. Gary, you're going to have to edit that out. Um, no, it's okay. The Dalai Lama says it's okay to swat mosquitoes. So I'm cleared on that one. That's that, it's so relevant, so relevant. These before I go through the rest of the precepts, these precepts, if we hold them as living guideposts, then they can be so complex to understand and so non-literal. If I take it literally, non-killing, we've talked about this, then I can't eat because I'm going to kill something. I mean, I might not do it. It might be the butcher or the farmer or somebody, but something is going to get killed because I'm eating. And so there's not a single day in my life where I keep that precept perfectly. And I am a wanton killer of mosquitoes. I don't even have much remorse when I swat a mosquito. And yet I try to have reverence for all life. I try to, be as respectful of every being and its right to live as I can. And I walk through the woods and I'm an 800-pound gorilla stepping on plants and kicking things over, no matter how careful I try to be. So, in a sense, to me, that's what's wonderful about these precepts. They are elusive and they are very existential. And they require us each to have our own understanding, each to have our own way of complying with what we believe is the intention of the precept. So the sixth grade precept, am I up to sixth? Oh, yes. Sixth grade precept, back to the village Zendo, not discussing the faults of others. That's a pretty unambiguous one. That should be easy to keep. Everybody that keeps that one perfectly, raise their hand. Right? It's a trap that we fall into very often. And it has a cousin, the seventh precept, which I don't like their version here, but they say not praising yourself while abusing others. And I've in our lineage, it's not praising yourself while blaming others. It's a close cousin of not discussing others' errors or faults. And maybe it should boil down to very simply that in our relationships, in our discussions, that we should be uplifting. We should be seeing the positive aspects. Not sure. Interesting. There's also a Zen peacemaker version of that precept. And what that says is speaking what I perceive to be the truth without guilt or blame. This is the precept of not elevating oneself and blaming others. And the eighth grade precept, not sparing the Dharma assets. Now that's now translated often as not being stingy. right? So it was originally about being stingy with the Dharma assets. And Zen peacemakers kind of have that slant to it, using all of the ingredients of my life. This is the precept of not being stingy. The ninth grave precept, not indulging in anger. When we have not being angry. I like that version, not indulging in anger, because if we say not being angry, that we have yet another ridiculously impossible precept. How many of us get through a single day without being angry at something? We have technology to remind us what getting angry feels like if we forget. Many times a day, I find myself swearing at the computer. Fortunately, the computer doesn't seem to be too offended by that. But we get angry. So I think that not indulging makes more sense to me because anger is essentially a normal human emotion. It arises in all of us sometimes. But if we have that moment of anger and we let it pass, we don't allow it to me, anger is a fire. The little spark is lit. There's a little flame. Now we can do one of two things. We can let that flame go right out, not feed it, or we can start feeding it, adding fuel. And soon we have a conflagration. We often do that. So to me, that's the aspect of indulging the anger, building it into a conflagration. Hours later, even days later, we're still fuming and swearing and whatever. So I like this version of that precept. Okay. I have three devices that I'm using at the moment. I'm on the computer and I've got my pad and my tablet. That is a truly exalted spiritual position to be in. Only a great teacher can handle three devices simultaneously. Okay, so the 10th grave precept, and they say not defaming the three treasures. So Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. But one of the wonderful things about Zen is that none of these precepts, whichever version you feel most comfortable with, are prescriptive. There's nobody who says you must feel this way, you must act this way. There is only one way to do this correctly. Moreover, I would go further and say, and there's no way to keep any of these precepts perfectly. They're aspirational. They're about the person that I would like to be and I will never be because I will die long before I achieve any sort of mastery of the precepts. There's not even such a thing, mastery of the precepts. I come back often to that notion of spirituality of imperfection. We are imperfect. We will always be imperfect. We can never keep the precepts perfectly because we are human. But we aspire, we try to do better. We try to protect the sanctity of life. We try to support the well-being of all of life, of all creatures, not just humans, but the plants, the animals, everything. And we fail every day. We try to be truthful in all our affairs. But inevitably, we're going to fall short. I was just talking to somebody recently about folks. There was a movie with Peter Sellers back in the 70s. I think it was called Being There. People remember that movie? Kate says that. Okay, good. I'm not just making this up. Good. and but the premise was that he had lived in a cloistered environment his whole life. He had no experience of living in society, of being with other humans. And at some point, he comes out from this cloister and he enters society, and he has no filters. The truth comes out, whatever it is, all the time. And that quickly goes from being sort of refreshing and unique to being a royal pain in the ass in his social engagements, right? We need, as a practical matter, to live our lives in society, we need some filters. So we keep the precepts, we try to keep them perfectly, and we keep them imperfectly. We fail, and I don't even, maybe shouldn't even use the word failing. If we try, if our effort is sincere, if we are working to keep the precept, then we are doing it as far as I'm concerned. Try sincerely. Be aware of it. One of the obviously that we know that core teachings of Thich Nhat Hanh is mindfulness, and you all know I have some problems with that. But that said, mindfulness is an essential ingredient with the precepts, right? I need to be aware of whether or not I'm killing. I need to be aware of whether or not I'm stealing. I need to be aware of being angry, and so on. So that paying attention is very important. Holding the precepts somewhere in our consciousness and using them as a template for living our lives. However imperfectly we do that, the precepts are aspiration. Okay, I'm going to stop there. People have thoughts, questions, rebuttals, regurgitations, revisitations.
Peter, I'll start off with um, I, I think you answered my question, but I was thinking just very recently about the precepts and putting them next to do not pick and choose, and um, and maybe a third place is being authentic. But I'm not going to go there. But I think you answered that because you said we need some filters. So that that means that we are picking and choosing those filters for our behavior. Um, so perhaps picking and choosing applies to different a different category. I'm not sure.
Well, not picking and choosing refers generally to not having preferences. Um, and and I see that in a way that sort of applies more or less globally to our lives. Okay. Because when I start to pick and choose, when I start to form opinions, when I start to have a definite course that I would like my life to follow, I'm now probably in conflict with the reality, right? Because the reality doesn't go according to my script. And that's where suffering arises, right?
Right.
If I'm sick, I'm sick. If I'm sick and I'm really annoyed about being sick, I'm suffering,
Yes.
right? Kind of that sort of thing. So not picking, choosing is an idea that we need to stay in that space of allowing reality to be what it is, even when it's not the version that we would prefer. If we take it too literally, we will go into a restaurant, we'll sit down with a menu, and we'll never come out because we'll be
Right.
stuck there not picking and choosing until the restaurant tour throws us out.
Mm-hmm.
We've got to pick and choose, right? It's kind of like, but on a more global level, it, maybe it should be not resisting life or not forming rigid conceptions of life, something like that.
And not wishing that things were different than they are, but still holding these guidelines of our life.
Yeah, I think so. And sometimes, again, yes. And right now in this moment, I'm betting that most of us are wishing that things were different than they are. And does Zen say, no, give that all up. It's all cool. Whatever Donald Trump does doesn't matter. Don't pick and choose. Where do we, where, where do we stand up? Where do we take a stand? Where do we act?
So, so that's the reality. Um, I don't want to um, go too far with wishing that the administration was different than it is, because it is what it is. But then I also have precepts that are telling me this is a way of behaving which violates my sense of how to live a life.
Well, yeah, yes, and I want to stop back up for a second because the precepts are only for us. They're not a criteria for evaluating others' behavior, right? And so each of us is responsible for adhering to the precept in the way that we understand it and in the context of our lives. They're not rules for others. If others violate the precept, I know this is if others violate the precept, that's their karma. That's their thing. And yet what we just saw in those precepts that Thich Nhat Hanh had, there's sort of that affirmative side. He says, yes, we have a responsibility. That's the socially engaged Buddhism. If we take the pure Dharma,
Right.
it's like, I'm only on my patch and I'm not worried about other people's stuff. But the socially engaged vision that Thich Nhat Hanh expressed there says, no, if there's, how did he say that? I want to come back to it. If I can remember which device it's on. I can't, yeah, so here. So his first precept is he says, do not kill. And then he says, do not let others kill, which directly contradicts what I said. And then he goes on, find whatever means possible to protect life. Do not live with a vocation that is harmful to humans and nature. So very interesting. I think in Zen, we see the precepts as highly personal, but he's expanding it. Do not let others kill.
Yeah. So he's kind of on the other end of the spectrum of Taoism. Not that I know very much about Taoism, but the Tao Te Ching is let it flow, let it go.
I'm just looking to see if there's something here that he offers some explanation. He's very clear here, which I think is interesting. Sometimes we do not speak out against killing, and that is also violating the precepts. Do not kill, do not let others kill. It is very difficult. You cannot do it perfectly. To practice the precepts means that you have the intention to go in the direction of not killing. You do the maximum in your power not to kill and not let others kill. The essential is not to be perfect, but to go in that direction. And he adds here, no one, including the Buddha, can practice this precept perfectly. He told his disciples not to travel much during the rainy seasons in order to avoid stepping on tiny living beings. They were trying their best to avoid killing. But it's again impossible. The Jains, as you probably know, travel with a little bell, and the little bell is to warn creatures out of their way so they don't step on them. Well, how many ants do you know that pay attention to little bells? Right?
Right.
Nothing. Even a mouse, a cat, they're not going to, who cares about a little bell? So, so we've got to fall short of our intent. But I think his is very different. When he's saying we have some responsibility, it's kind of coming again, contradicting what I said to a certain extent. I see the precepts as very personal. They're about me. They're about how I need to behave. But he's saying, no, we've got some obligation to help others as well behave that way as well.
Mhm.
I was thinking about the, you know, trying to go in the right way, the way that you're aiming at. And I was thinking in from my Christian education, they often talk about sinning, and the core meaning of sinning is comes from a an archery term that you're short of the mark. And and somehow it's gotten moved to being like evil and punishable. But when you're striving to aim at your goal, your aspirational goal, and you keep attempting and you fall short of the mark, that's the sinning part. But the sinning doesn't remove you from that. You're still an archer. You're still in that aspirational, um, you're living that life of aiming. I mean, I don't know if anybody's ever done archery before. I mean, you could use bowling as an example too, but you don't always get it right. More often than not, you miss or you fall short. And it's frustrating and difficult at times. And but as long as you keep aiming and being aspirational to hit your target, you are living the life of that archer. That, you are living the life of the goal, of getting to the goal of perfection. Well, I don't know if if you get perfection. You'd have to hit it every time, bullseye every time. I don't know who does that, but and of course the goal always moves, doesn't it? You know, you think you're getting close, and then well, it's further than you thought. So, you have to take some consolation that you're always in striving, you know, and you're trying doing your best, and really, being true to that.
Yeah, thank you. I think that metaphor of archery works pretty well in terms of um, not necessarily my archery, but um, but that idea that's that aspirational piece. We want to hit the middle of the target every time, and then the arrows go where they go, and we deal with the consequences. Um,
So what's coming up for me, the first the Jane thing, I think that bell could be seen as reminding the walker to be aware, not to necessarily warn the mouse, but the walker, the intention, the little bell, be aware, be aware, be aware. And in terms of following the precepts, so the thing that keeps coming back to me is in Judaism, in I think it's Pirkei Avot, the sayings of the fathers. Um, we were taught not to say anything about anybody because the thought was if you say anything, you would tend towards ultimately gossip and saying something bad. And there was a belief that the second temple was destroyed because of Lashon Hara, because people saying evil. And that was a big deal. So in our, so the conflict for me about that is what would that mean to not share saying good about others? That it's such a severe thing to say, I'm so afraid of the tendency for the human condition to turn towards saying something negative at some point, that I won't say anything. And so the flip side of that is to be willing to speak well of others, knowing that the human condition is such that that could turn into something negative, but you still try. You still try. You still try to uphold and hope that it doesn't end up being an arrow shot into somebody. Uh, and so another aspect is, for me, it seems like when I feel myself failing or breaking the aspirations, one thing that it seems to bring me back to is compassion. So I have compassion for myself and compassion for all of us. So you have these ridiculous, petty or mean or whatever emergences, and you can see, oh, that might be why so and so decompensated and did something that we mostly can agree is terrible, like taking out the gun and shooting somebody. But all of us have the opportunity to experience the seeds of this and the origins of this. So it feels like it's not just working on oneself personally, but as an awareness of the human condition, which kind of goes back to the bell. The little bell that's ringing when you're walking and you're remembering that despite your best efforts, you are killing. So that's it.
Which reminds me of something I heard on Grantchester the other night. Does anybody ever watch Grantchester on PBS? Anyway, kind of fun. But the two main protagonists, one is um, a vicar, an Anglican minister, and the other is a detective. Um, and they're having a conversation, and the minister says, talking about someone, says, "Well, there's no way he could have done the murder. He's just too nice and kind a person," something to that effect. And the detective says, "We're all capable of it." Kind of that duality. We're all capable of it.
So it's being willing to say something. This is, I'm just being willing to say something good about somebody, knowing that you could end up falling short and stirring an eddy of negativity in the process, versus, I'm just saying, the Jewish perspective, that perfection would be don't say a word. Being willing to be imperfect, as you always say. We're human, we're out there, that's the story.
As you're saying that, I'm trying to think, is there any way that we could be perfect about it? I don't see, if we locked ourselves in a room all day and didn't interact with the world, would that be perfect? Maybe not. maybe we'd be killing by not being out helping others, or I think it's just a fact of living in this reality that we are not perfect. We cannot ever be perfect, and yet we can continually strive to be better. That's where the archer analogy makes sense to me. Right? The archer's always trying to hit the center of the target. She's not going like, well, I'm just going to throw some arrows out there randomly, but she may not hit it for years.
I read a little bit of a essay that Thich Nhat Hanh wrote, and it starts off with this. He says, "It wasn't until I had a toothache that I realized how good it felt not to have a toothache." And it struck me like, of course, like we're going to make mistakes and we're going to have bad things happen to us and we're going to be in painful situations. It's or miss the mark and feel maybe bad about it or hurt someone inadvertently. But those are the ways we realize how good it is not to do those things. It's a weird learning process, but maybe it's not that weird, but um, it helps you to accept that you are you know, imperfect and appreciate when it does hit right, what the goal is and to refine that and make sure that you're aiming at something um that's true.
Thank you. Now I've got to sort of like turn off my Zen, take off my Zen hat. You may not even see it, and maybe I'm more in the realm of psychology. I don't know, but I find it very, and I use this continually with the folks that I'm working with at the recovery house, the folks who are dealing with their addictions, to have a gratitude practice. And it's something that I do every day, and I encourage them to do every day, is what have I got to be grateful for in this moment? And no matter what kind of day I've had, there always is a long list of things that I could be grateful for. And for them, it's very important. Well, I shouldn't say it that way. It's important for all of us, because we can so easily become negative. And that negativity then feeds anger, it feeds fear, it feeds separation, right? If we're talking about being in connection, in community, then, and avoiding that separation, gratitude helps. Gratitude helps me to see that the cup is half full, in fact. Um, so certainly not a Zen thing. Zen would always take sort of a pure position of neutrality, I think, but I think it can be useful, especially when the weight of the world right now is so negative and can force us into a place of despair, can force us into a place of fear, that we can kind of pause and say, no, wait a minute, all of these things are going right. And it might be, hey, I don't have a toothache right now. But look how, but look at that. When Catherine was saying that, I was thinking about Peter Harris and what he just went through. And not everybody knows that, but Peter, who's a Zen teacher, and he's one of my Dharma successors. maybe I did mention this recently. His wife had just come back from Ireland from a wonderful trip, blah, blah, blah. And then within a few days, she died of some type of disease or infection that she came back with. It's totally shocking. She was such a healthy woman, right? And so we don't know. I mean, in this moment, things change that can change that fast, right? That fast. So then when they're not there, are we grateful?
So hi guys, this is Tom. Hi Peter. Um, I'm not really familiar with like Zen Buddhism or Buddhism in general. I mean, I've read quite a bit about Dalai Lama, and I've read Thich Nhat Hanh, but I don't. I thanks for that run through the precepts. I had no knowledge of that before today. So, um, but what struck me is how similar that is to say like the Ten Commandments. Um, and what struck me about, as you were going through the 16 and the 8 and the 5 and the Ten Commandments, and there are these similar themes, I think, throughout all practices and religions. There's and when you were talking about the gratitude, that what struck me anyway is, those are very well, don't do this and don't do that and don't do this. And there's a sense of discipline there, which I think is good. I don't mean that in a negative way. I think we're all being human. There's a bunch of stuff I do that be better if I didn't. And it's good to be reminded about that. And I was thinking about just being human, when you're talking about that, it seems like we say this all the time, but the reality is we are human. And, kind of, for me anyway, I hear a lot of people talk about the idea of perfection. Well, I hear this expression, well, I'm not perfect. Well, we're all so far away from that. It's almost a silly expression because, being human, being perfect are so antithetical to each other, I think, from a aspirational viewpoint. But I think what Susan talked about, wishing things were different than they are. Um, I will just speak for myself, and there's been some difficult period for the last few years I've been going through, and one of the things I think I'm learning, is that to overcome that natural inclination when you're going through a difficult period or something you don't like, whether it's big or small, whether it's I really don't like the way this day is shaping up already, or I just don't like this thing. And for me, I think that is something, these ideas of the kind of discipline that comes from, trying to adhere maybe to these precepts and striving. I think it's a kind of like a muscle type of building a muscle, whether I'm paying attention to, not gossiping or not stepping on something I don't need to. That's all discipline. It's all spiritual discipline, I think. And for me, um, you know, the idea of how do I counter that my natural inclination to want things to be different than they are. I and I and I think Peter, I'm familiar with some of that recovery idea. I think gratitude is really important. And I also feel like, the idea of in the moment, in the day. So when I say things, I wish things were different, this moment, they don't really need to be different. I'm fine this moment. I mean, most of the things that I want to be different are really projections in my head. And I think that, I really appreciate the meditation this morning to bring me into the present. And I do find I try to have a regular practice of meditation now. And that does release a lot of that future thinking that gets me in trouble. So I know those comments were probably all over the place, but this is kind of the idea of the precepts and everything is kind of new to me. So appreciate you all being here.
Well, thank you for being here. Thank you. a lot of this, and I think that this is core in much of Thich Nhat Hanh's teaching, is half the battle is paying attention. Maybe more than half the battle is paying attention. How much of our lives do we go through on autopilot? And we just, in when you do that mindfulness-based stress reduction stuff, so they make an important distinction between reaction and response. Reaction is the autopilot. You say something to me and I go, fuck you, whatever. And the response is I slow down and I think, okay, and I create a space in which I can be compassionate, in which I can come from a different place. And that's grounded in paying attention, right? In not being on autopilot and being aware. And so to that extent, I think that awareness is very important. We can't even start to work on the precepts or anything else until we are aware. What I am doing and what its impacts are. And that sometimes that may be enough. There may not actually be anything I can change, but I've brought the awareness to it and I've made that a conscious intention and not an accident. Okay, the hour is growing late. Anybody have a final comment before we say our vows? Okay.
Creations are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to put an end to them. Reality is boundless. I vow to perceive it. The enlightened way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody it. Creations are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to put an end to them. Reality is boundless. I vow to perceive it. The enlightened way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody it. Creations are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to put an end to them. Reality is boundless. I vow to perceive it. The enlightened way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody it.
Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful rest of your Sunday.